appreciate it. So, all right, well, first of all, thank you very much, Hope and Michelle and the entire IFOPA, and also to all of the families for being here. It means a lot to me to come every session or every time that we have. Oh, this one we're over to?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. All right. It means a lot to be part of this community, and we really appreciate all of the support, both from the research side, but also our ability to provide care. So, as Hope mentioned, I'm Ed Hsiao. I'm an endocrinologist over at the University of California in San Francisco. I help direct the Metabolic Bone Clinic. We see well over 70 families now with FOP. And I'm honored to give this presentation today, basically a little bit about the research highlights in about 15 minutes. And when I should mention that I am supported by a number of different people. We have a number of research funding for our projects, including some prior research that has involved FOP and collaborations with a number of different companies. I am a clinical trialist, and so we do see patients with FOP in the Clementi and Ipsen clinical trials. And I also do other studies for other diseases. So none of these pose any conflicts of interest for the first presentation, and we'll talk a little bit about this later on. But all of the views that are expressed are my own. So, all right, so I have really big shoes to fill. We all love Fred, and we're very sad that he's not here. And I will try my best to do justice to this. So we really miss Fred. And I think one of the things that really inspired me for the first family gathering that I ever went to was Fred's presentation, his comprehensive knowledge of basically everything that went on in the field of FOP. But what I would like to do today is actually talk a little bit more about some of the research that has really occurred in the past year. And I think this is really important because as families, as a patient myself, I want to know what's going on out there. And one of the things that is really important to think about is what has happened to the literature. So if you look at, if you just use PubMed and look at FOP and look at fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, you can see that at the very beginning, there weren't that many publications. But it was really only around 2006 with the discovery of the gene that everything just really exploded. And now we are getting close to, so there's now 2,800 publications as of October 12th. And if you look at this, there are probably close to 180 publications in 2022 to 2023. So this has become a very active field. We're only going to highlight a few of the major ones today. I'm going to apologize profusely to the other authors and the other teams that have made seminal contributions that we're not going to bring together and show you today. But my goal for today is actually just to show you a little bit about what is going on from the patient standpoint, what I felt was probably most important to you as families, and really just touch upon the literature. I will be talking a little bit about clinical and translational research, so different types of projects that are relevant to clinical care and what we do in the clinic. Some of the clinical trial results, the very exciting clinical trial results that have been published in the past year, and a little bit about basic research, because this, I think, is what tells you what's coming down the pike in terms of opportunities. So I'm going to start with clinical management and translational research studies. So for this session, we're going to have question and answers at the end. It's a little bit difficult for me to see things, but if you just want to jump up and ask questions, that's all good. I'm happy to be interrupted, okay? So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was a study that came out, and this was a retrospective analysis that was led by Fred Kaplan and Bob Pignolo. And I thought that this was really important because in the past, anytime that we have a fracture in a patient with FOP, we have always thought about, does this patient actually need surgery? And what Fred was looking at was basically looking back at 36 patients with FOP, 41 fractures that actually occurred, and what actually happened. And the critical thing that I want people to take away from this is that non-operative management of fractured needs to be considered for patients with FOP because it decreases the chances of heterotopic ossification. So for unclear reasons, if you have a fracture and you don't do surgery for it, you're less likely to actually get heterotopic ossification. So, and the critical part behind this is that 4 fractures out of 41 resulted in a reported loss of motion. Okay? So this is a change in how we think about management. It does mean that when patients go and if they have a fracture, when you talk to the clinicians, like the surgeons, it's like, what can we do to manage them without having to go through surgery? The next set of papers that I want to just talk about really briefly was a series of 4 papers that came out looking at COVID-19 vaccinations. And the interesting thing about this is that the COVID-19 vaccinations, as many of you know, the vaccines are essentially given by intramuscular injection. And the mRNA vaccines have to be intramuscular. They don't work particularly well if you give them subcutaneously. So we wanted to know whether or not this was actually important and whether or not this would actually still give you good protection, but also whether or not this would lead to a flare. And so we identified 23 patients that were vaccinated. There were no reports of heterotopic ossification. There was 1 or 2 patients that did have flares. We also followed 19 patients who reported to us about COVID. And so those patients, there were flares that were reported. Although we did not report that there were any deaths related to COVID, we did hear anecdotally separately that there were some patients who passed away from COVID. So it is not an easy disease to manage. And that there were reports of worsening flares with COVID. So I think this is really important for us to keep in mind because at least for COVID-19, the mRNA vaccines appear to be relatively safe when given appropriately. And for those of you who are considering vaccination, the ICC has actually put together guidelines and instructions on how we think would be best to try to minimize the risk of flares, and that's on the iccfop.org website. Okay? So it's nice because there's actually now 4 papers that actually support the ability to give COVID-19 vaccinations. So the other publication which I want to highlight is pain. So as a clinician seeing patients with FOP, I see patients who often have pain. But interestingly, when we talk to other clinicians, they're like, oh no, FOP is a disease of bone formation. It's not a disease of pain. And that's not right. And so what we were doing in this particular study was looking at ACVR1, and this is led by Hsiao. And basically, we documented that patients with FOP actually do have pain. But not only that, is that if you measure their sensitivity of their skin, you can see that patients with FOP have increased mechanical sensitivity and also increased temperature sensitivity. And that's important because I think it comes back and reflects what the patient community has been telling us as clinicians and researchers, and so now we can document that. One of the things that Hsiao did was that he was able to make iPS cell-derived nerve cells, so nociceptors. These are the neurons in the skin and the body that detect irritation or different types of mechanical problems. And you can show that the FOP iPS cell nociceptors are actually much more sensitive to stimuli than normal. And so this finding is helping us guide different types of pain management strategies in terms of what would be the better strategies for helping patients with FOP. There's been a lot of interest in terms of what's been going on for the social and clinical impact of FOP, and I'm just going to highlight 2 papers here. This is the Burden of Illness Survey led by Mona Al-Muqaddam over at the University of Pennsylvania, and also a study that was actually brought together by multiple companies that are involved in rare bone diseases, really just trying to figure out different strategies for outreach and making sure that clinicians all around the world have access to the key resources that are important for appropriate diagnosis and speeding up the diagnosis of rare conditions. So I'm going to move on to some of the exciting advances in clinical trials. These are new treatment options and investigations. And just to show you a little bit about some of the different types of drugs that are being considered in investigational agents. So the first one I'm going to touch on is Palovarotene. And Palovarotene, actually, we had the phase 2 and the phase 3 studies published last year. These were critical for the FDA approval process here in the United States and also in Canada. This medication is an oral retinoid. It is related to isoretinoin or Accutane. It's the medication that is used for treating acne. And the key idea behind this was that if a fetus is exposed to Accutane or to isoretinoin, they have skeletal defects, and that's because it inhibits the bone and cartilage formation process. And so it's the use of this side effect as a class to really try to block the heterotopic ossification in FOP. The paper showed basically a 50 to 60% reduction in new heterotopic ossification. As many of you know, this was done on what's called a post hoc analysis, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on. But this is a study that did identify that there were some key side effects with premature growth plate closure and potential risks for osteoporosis, but also pretty significant skin and mucocutaneous effects. I will point out that this medication was not approved by the EMA. There was a very extensive and comprehensive FDA discussion, and if any of you are interested in the pros and cons of the Palovarotene, I encourage you to go and look on the FDA website because that entire process was recorded and documented, and it's very intriguing to see the thought processes that people went through. And there's an ICC statement about the use of Palovarotene. You can all look on the ICC FOP website. The other medication that I'd like to highlight is garetosmab. It completed its phase 2 study and had a very nice publication over in Nature Medicine. The endpoints that were used was was looking at lesion activity, but lesion activity was not reduced, at least in the first part of their study. But the number of new HO lesions in the placebo population was reduced. And so I just want to point out that the endpoints are a little bit different than what was originally proposed, but it is still a medication that has the potential to be really useful for patients with FOP. There were 5 deaths in the study, and that investigators did not think that this was related to the medication itself. But at this point, it is going into phase 3, and there is a study that's going on. There are other, to better understand what the potential benefits are. There were some key side effects, including nosebleeds, skin abscesses, and matarosis, which is loss of eyebrows. And so we look forward to seeing more about this. I also want to highlight that there was a new case series that was published from the group in Russia. These are 13 patients with FOP that were treated for 2 years with a medication called tofacitinib. This is an immune suppressant that is used in a number of rheumatologic disorders. They reported that there was no changes in CAGES scores. There was a 31% reported increase in range of motion. They did not actually have a lot of detailed X-ray quantitative imaging. But this, to me, was really important because this adds to a growing list of off-label options for patients with FOP, and specifically the pediatric population. And so the other medications that are also in kind of the same molecular pathway are imatinib and also canakinumab and anakinra. So it will be very intriguing to sort of see how all of these different types of medications and options come to fruit. So the last thing in the next few minutes is really just where are things going in the basic sciences direction. So we feel that better understanding of FOP will lead to better treatments. So one of the things that was supported by the IFOPA was the concept of gene therapy. And so for gene therapy with FOP, there's been 2 sets of groups that have been working on this. And these are novel strategies really for trying to suppress the mutant ACVR1 allele. And so in the first paper, this was from Jae-Hook Shim's lab, basically they showed that they could inhibit heterotopic ossification in mice. And then there's also a different lab from Toshi Yokoda's lab over in Canada that really used a slightly different strategy, but could also suppress the heterotopic ossification. And this is important because I think this sets the stage for future development of different strategies for humans. Gene therapy is something that NIH and a lot of different groups are very interested in, but there's big challenges in terms of how we could take these from a mouse into a human and to do this safely. So this is going to be something to watch. Inflammation continues to be a key driver of FOP, and I think this is an important aspect to consider, especially given some of those off-label medications that we use. For those situations of patients with really severe intractable FOP flares. And so there are a number of other papers that have come out that have really supported some of our original hypotheses that inflammation really drives the heterotopic ossification process and the production of activin A. And so this has been really nice to see. in terms of a different avenue that might be useful for treating patients. And then the last thing just to bring up really quickly is that there are a number of models now for FOP. It's not just looking at humans, it's not just looking at mouse models, but there are now a number of fish models that are out. The reason that we as basic scientists are really interested in fish is that they grow much faster than mice and certainly humans, and so that allows us to do a lot more different studies and test a lot more different hypotheses. And so there are a number of strategies looking at gene-gene interactions. Why is it that some patients with FOP have much more severe disease progression than other patients, even though they share the same mutation, but also looking at different types of interactions with different proteins and what exactly the protein is doing. So these, I think, are really valuable for understanding the next phases of what different types of molecular targets there might be. And there's continued search for therapeutic targets. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are a number of different pathway components that we can actually now target and look to see whether or not that these modifying these different types of targets may actually be important for the progression of FOP, but also as therapeutic targets. So just really quickly, COVID vaccination can be safely done and should be considered. There's some non-operative fracture care data now, and then also neuropathic pain does occur in patients with FOP, and that has helped guide some changes in terms of how we manage the pain. Clinical trials, palovarotene is now approved in the United States, Canada, and UAE. We'll talk a little bit more about that in my next session. There are other compounds that continue in clinical trials. And there are a couple of compounds that can be used, medications now that can be used for off-label treatment, specifically geared towards patients with FOP that are not responding to standard of care therapy. So I want to emphasize that that is actually currently reserved for patients with really intractable disease. And then the basic scientists continue to provide new insights with our genetic interactions, fish models, ACVR1 biology. And our hope is that in the long run that we'll be able to develop some sort of targeted therapy or gene therapy. All right, so I think, are there any quick questions about this? Because I have got a little bit more to go. Okay, so hopefully I did Fred some justice in terms of the summary. I just want to start by thanking my team. We were very fortunate at UCSF. We have a large group of roughly about 13 people that are involved in clinical research and basic science research, and it's actually been a lot of fun to work with them. So, okay. So I'm going to move on to the next very brief talk. This is about palovarotene in FOP. I will point out the disclosures haven't changed in the past 10 minutes, but this presentation does involve palovarotene. I need to declare that I was involved in the clinical trials, testing and presenting to the FDA, and the views that I'm discussing today are my own. They do not represent IPSN, they do not represent the ICC, and they do not represent the IFOPA. Okay? So when we think about strategies for treating patients with FOP, there are actually a number of different ways and places that we could target. So one of them is actually hitting at the very, very top, very specific to FOP, like you target the mutation, right? We know that that should, in theory, be a good treatment. And there are a number of different drugs that are kinase inhibitors that sort of target the mutation in itself. In the long term, maybe genetic repair through gene therapy. But there are also other parts of this pathway that actually lead to bone formation that are more generalizable. In other words, they're not specific only to FOP, but to any type of disease that is related to heterotopic ossification. And so, at least in the situation of FOP, there's the medication garetosmab, which is an anti-activin A inhibitor. This is the Regeneron investigational agent. And so that one hits the activin A. And then there's this other medication, palovarotene. And palovarotene decreases the BMP signaling that is induced by ACVR1, but it also blocks ossification. And so we're going to talk briefly about palovarotene. So the idea behind palovarotene was to block the BMP signaling, the abnormal BMP signaling that was induced by the ACVR1 mutation, as well as to block the bone and cartilage formation process. And the seminal piece of mouse data that came was in 2011, where you could take a medication that was similar to palovarotene and treat a mouse model of FOP. And what you could see on the blue boxes, on the left-hand side, the vehicle, that is basically just what happens in terms of the heterotopic ossification in the mouse without any sort of treatment. Retinoic acid, which is a related compound, and then this study compound. And you can see that it can block the heterotopic ossification in the mouse animals. It's like we were talking about, it's similar to Accutane or isoretinoin. And if any of you have seen anybody who's taken it, the idea is to dry out the skin. Long-term use does actually increase the risk of pancreatitis, and it is teratogenic, as we talked about, because it does block the bone formation process in developing fetuses. The palovarotene program has been going on for quite some time. You can talk to the Ipsen team in more detail about this if you're interested, but it actually started in 2014. And this has gone on, and it was finally approved by the FDA in this year, 2023. And as you can see, there's actually a lot of steps that have gone through this particular process. What I want to point out and talk about just very briefly is the phase 3 open label MOVE trial. And this was the trial that was used for the FDA approval. They recruited patients with the classical ACVR1 R206H mutation, as well as, non-classical FOP. And they used whole body CT scan as a way to quantitate the amount of new heterotopic ossification in that form. It was a 3-year study. Palovarotene was given at a flare dose, which was 20 milligrams for 4 weeks, followed by 10 milligrams for another 8 weeks. And then there was a 5 milligrams per day chronic. So when there wasn't a flare, the patients were still on this medication. And this was compared to the open label, as the study to the natural history study cohort to try to increase the power. So the first thing that I want to point out is that the 2 cohorts between the MOVE trial, this is the phase 3 trial, the patients who received the drug, and the natural history study, which are the patients who did not receive the drug and sort of the baseline data, were pretty similar. There were some differences, and I'll point out to the bottom is the flare rates. I do have a laser pointer, sorry, but you can't see it. So the flare rates at the bottom over here are a little bit different. But for the most part, the ages were pretty similar, and then the number of flares that were present were kind of similar. So there's aspects, I think, about this that allow you to compare the 2 studies. But I want to point out that one of the key things for this study is that if any of you had heard about it, it met what we call futility criteria. So in any clinical trial, before the trial starts, there's a set of criteria that are established that says that if we think that, or if the monitoring committee thinks that the drug is either doing harm or is actually not beneficial, it meets what we call futility. In other words, we should stop the trial because this is probably not benefiting the particular subjects. So this is part of the safety monitoring. And one of the issues for palovarotene, unfortunately, is that there was some unexpected impact of the differences in the time points, as well as some of the interesting aspects about heterotopic ossification. I will point out that what was unexpected was, we typically think of heterotopic ossification as being permanent. Once it's there, it's not going to go away. But in the statistical analysis, what was discovered was that a number of patients with FOP actually lost heterotopic ossification. So the quantitation of of total body HO was actually lower. And so negative numbers don't play well with square roots. And so unfortunately, the statistical method that was used for this was not valid. And so this led to having the study meet futility criteria, and so the study was actually stopped early. Now, this was also complicated by COVID shutdowns. Now, as a result of that, it meant that the data was unblinded and that the primary way of analyzing the statistics, which is supposed to be determined before the study starts, was not going to be valid. And so what the study ended up relying on is what we call post hoc analysis. In other words, you have to take the data, you unblind it, you look at it, and you apply different methods to try to fix what was the shortcoming in your original study. This is not the ideal way for a study to proceed, and that, I think, is a major criticism and a major concern about this particular study. But when you do this post hoc analysis, what was shown was that there was roughly a 50 to 60% reduction in the amount of heterotopic ossification in the patients who received palovarotene. And one of the things that I would encourage you to go listen to the FDA discussion, because the FDA discussion goes through, and there are 3 analyses that Ipsen did, plus 2 analyses that the FDA did from the same data on their own that basically support this. And I think that that is extremely helpful to learn about, because that tells you that there are multiple people who are thinking about this from a different perspective in terms of whether or not there is benefit. And this is just to show you a little bit from that data. So there's a 54% decrease in the set, and these are specifically looking at patients who went from the natural history study into the MOVE trial, so went from no treatment to palovarotene. And as you can see, that there were still some patients, they had more heterotopic ossification in MOVE. So the palovarotene didn't work for everybody, but there was still a fairly large number that seemed to have less new heterotopic ossification, when they went into MOVE. Okay? And I think one of the key things that has come out in the FDA discussion that I think is really important to take a look at is really understanding what happens for patients who were treated on palovarotene. And you can see that this is the amount of new heterotopic ossification that occurred for the patients at the beginning. There were a number of patients who were interrupted, either because of COVID or because of the FDA decision not to give patients palovarotene above age 14 because of one of the side effects, the growth plate closure, which we'll talk about too. But in those situations, the patients who went off of treatment, they actually got more new heterotopic ossification. And then when the treatment was allowed to restart, those patients actually, you can see their heterotopic ossification went down. And so this type of on-off-on analysis is also very helpful to validate the quality of the data that is there. Palovarotene is not an easy drug to take. There's a number of adverse events. As you can see from this, basically pretty much everybody, like 96% of the patients actually had some sort of adverse event. And the most common ones were skin-related. So these were going to be like rashes and hair loss and dry skin. These are side effects that are common to this class of medications and not particularly surprising. There were a number of other adverse events that were considered serious. These included COVID-19, which was recorded just as we didn't know whether or not this might be related to palovarotene, but it's probably not related to palovarotene, but it was coded as a serious adverse event. Fractures, premature epiphyseal closure, which we'll talk about in a moment, and also osteoporosis. So the big thing that I think is important to keep in mind is this side effect of premature epiphyseal closure. So this is your growth plates in the bones normally will stay open up through puberty so that a person grows. And what happened, what was observed in the MOVE trial was that a number of patients actually had early growth plate closure. And what was seen was basically that there was a larger percentage of patients who actually had slower growth that was occurring with decreased growth velocity over time as compared to the patients in the natural history study. And if you look at the breakdown by age, it's really in the younger kids, so basically below 8 and 10. So this was 8 years old for girls and 10 years old for boys. This was potentially a worrisome side effect that was, and so it was actually part of the protocol to be monitored as a part of a bone safety monitoring by x-rays. But unfortunately, there were still some patients that were significantly affected by this. What's intriguing is that the cause of this premature epiphyseal closure still has not been identified. There's no good way to predict which patients are actually going to get it. It's not clear whether this is part of the FOP phenotype that patients will have in general, because as you know, there's actually a very wide spectrum. When we look at the kids with FOP, there's a very wide spectrum in terms of their heights and their weights. But I point this out because this is actually the rationale for the medication not being available for children below 8 or 10. Okay. The other thing just to keep in mind is that as part of the study, patients who had the whole body CT scan the CT scans were analyzed using a new computational method called the BCT, or biomechanical computed tomography. So if any of you have ever had an osteoporosis screen with a bone density scan, the idea behind that was just to see whether or not your bone densities are lower and that you might be at risk for osteoporosis. But for patients with FOP, we can't do that because there's so much heterotopic ossification, and the computer can't distinguish between what's heterotopic ossification and normal bone. And so in this particular study, they used the CT scans and they were able to analyze them mathematically. And this has not been used in patients with FOP before, so there is some caveats in terms of the interpretation. But what was clear was that some of the patients with FOP seem to have decreased bone densities at baseline, but also with palovarotene treatment. And so this is an aspect of palovarotene that is still under study and needs to be better understood, especially as patients go on this for long-term therapy. So we don't know how much of this is because of FOP, just the lack of mobility or the inability to weight bear, versus the palovarotene components. So just really quickly, a couple of conclusions. I really want to point you to the ICC FOP website. There is a pretty comprehensive discussion and an open press release that the ICC put together that really discusses the pros and cons of palovarotene. This was put together by 21 physicians that have expertise in FOP. You will see that there is very wide opinion, and this is, I think, really important for you to understand and to take into account for your own particular situation, whether palovarotene is right for you. The data does show that palovarotene can decrease new heterotopic ossification by about 50 to 60% in patients with FOP. This was identified through multiple post-hoc analyses. The longitudinal data does suggest that there are benefits for the new heterotopic ossification. It is a complex regimen, so there's chronic dosing, there's flare-based dosing, and then there's also weight-based dosing for younger patients, things like that. There are side effects for palovarotene. The major ones are the skin and mucous membrane issues. This is a class effect. It's really important to control this with different types of skin medications. I will just put a little plug here. The retinoids do increase the sensitivity to the sun, so if you are on palovarotene or planning to take palovarotene, please use sunscreen because you will burn. It is teratogenic. The patients who are taking it need to use contraception, or their partners also need to use contraception. There's early growth plate closure. This might be FOP related itself, separate from the palovarotene, but because of this, it is not used in young children. I say avoid, but I think in reality, it should be don't use it in children outside of what the FDA has approved. So basically above 8 and 10. And the risk of bone loss, osteoporosis, is still really kind of not understood, and so this needs to be examined. If somebody is thinking about palovarotene, one of the other key things is that you cannot take it with tetracycline medications. So any retinoid, not just palovarotene, with tetracycline increases the risk of a condition called pseudotumor cerebri. Don't do that. And then there's the potential increase for triglycerides. This is also a class effect. It's actually an increase in the lipids in your blood. So if this is something that you're considering, talk to your clinician, your FOP team, to see whether or not this makes sense, that this is a potential treatment option. Palovarotene should not be combined with any other investigational agents. I want to make sure that that is clear, so don't take it if you are in somebody else's clinical study, because that will make it very difficult. If this is something that you're thinking about, make sure you talk about it with their team before you enroll in the study, or if you are in the study, make sure you talk with that clinical team before you start palovarotene, okay? So that is really important to do. So the main steps to obtain palovarotene, if it's approved, if it's available in the areas that you're approved, where it is approved, discuss with your physicians. At least in the United States, you will need a local prescribing physician. So unfortunately, with the end of the COVID pandemic, emergency sort of regulations. Anybody who is, it's very difficult to write prescriptions across state lines. So you need to have a prescribing physician that is there. And make sure you also connect with the IPS Cares program, because they will help provide support in terms of trying to get the Palovarotene together. Use contraception, use sunscreen and sunglasses. And this process is evolving, and hopefully will get smoother over time. But again, making sure you discuss this with your physicians is really important. All right, I think my slides are available to everybody later on. There are some key resources if this is something that you want to photograph. Again, I want to point you to the ICC FOP website, because this is really important. And then also to the FDA Advisory Committee meeting materials, because I think that gives a really detailed, comprehensive exam of all of the data and all of the results. So again, thank you very much. I have to thank my research team here, which has really made it a wonder to do all of these different types of projects. I'm very fortunate to be able to do everything from the lab and the wet lab and the bench and the bedside all the way to the clinical side. And that's really been a privilege. And so thank you very much.